Hey everybody, it's Bill Doyle, Preservation Programs Manager with Heritage Works, bringing you our April installment of ArchiTREK. Here we are today at the Dubuque County Courthouse, and with me as always is Heritage Works kind of volunteer extraordinaire, Jason Nisus, who loves to help us out with our ArchiTREK tours.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, everybody. So I am the Vice Chair of the Dubuque County Historic Preservation Commission, and I love partnering with Heritage Works on these tours because it's a great chance for us to highlight some of Dubuque's most spectacular architecture. Not only do we get to see it and really help introduce you to why these buildings matter, but we really get to dig in deep and go inside and some of the undiscovered spaces that sometimes you don't get to see, and help you get the full picture of why these buildings matter, why preserving them is important, and what they add to the cultural landscape of our community.
The first courthouse in Dubuque was built all the way back in 1839. That was just 2 years after Dubuque was chartered, and when it was still very much a rough and tumble mining town. The building was used as a courthouse, while a jail addition was later added to its rear. The architects on the original courthouse project were likely Samuel Wilkins or Joseph Ogilby, or perhaps both of them working together. During that time, architecture was not really a professionalized business, and almost all buildings, even highly important and architecturally detailed ones, were designed by what's called carpenter builders. These would have been highly skilled superintendents who would have drawn up plans based largely on design books from elsewhere. Some of them wouldn't have even drawn up plans, and they would have just taken designs from these other design books and pattern books. The idea of professional architecture with professional designers would have been exceedingly uncommon at the time, especially in 1839 Dubuque, which was essentially part of the Wild West. Although the courthouse building was not architect designed, it still featured some stylistic influences that we could pin to different architectural styles. The most interesting and prominent of which is this massive two-story round arch entrance. As we can see from the old design, it also had these eave returns, which sort of suggest a traditional impediment, such as from Greek classical architecture. We could also see that the building had these exaggerated rectangular hood moldings to shed water above the windows. The original design was a strictly linear rectangular design, and it preceded this jail addition to its rear. That small, unassuming building served as the courthouse all the way until 1893, when the new courthouse building took its place. At that time, the small building would have looked incredibly quaint in the context of 1893 Dubuque. Gilded Age edifices were springing up all over the city. There was sort of a fever pitch of demand for high-quality architecture, as most of Dubuque's frontier architecture, all the wooden shacks and false fronts that you would assume with western towns like in Deadwood, South Dakota, was that it had already been replaced by that time. Even other high design buildings, such as the Globe Building, which was built in the 1840s, didn't live up to the architectural sensibilities and demands of our Victorian Dubuque ancestors. And during the 1850s, further investment had gone into the courthouse site when John Raguse, who maybe we could call Dubuque's first professional architect, built his Egyptian Revival jail, which is now considered so historically significant that it's now a National Historic Landmark. When the 1893 building was built, there was some discussion of relocating the building, not building it on the same site. Citizens actually put forth an idea to use the Jackson Park site for the building. This idea thankfully was shut down by Judge Benjamin Lacey and other prominent citizens. The idea of moving the courthouse to a site further north was that those neighborhoods were really filling out at the time, especially with worker cottages and light industrial buildings. So the idea of a courthouse there would be more towards the center of what would be the future town in their minds. So it was eventually decided to build the new courthouse on the current lot. Friedel & Heer and Sons were chosen as the architect, and they were probably the most prestigious architects working in Dubuque at the time. Friedel & Heer Jr. had actually been made partner with Pops in 1887, just 5 or 6 years prior, and the courthouse was probably the most prominent project that they had worked on together at that time. Friedel & Heer Sr. was a Swiss-born, and he worked in Europe under a man named Theodosius Florentini, who is a highly known Jesuit priest at Chur, Switzerland, sort of a priest activist. Heer evidently left Switzerland, taking Friedel & Heer Jr. with him. Maybe they were pushed out by the events of the Civil War in Switzerland at the time, which had Protestants and Catholics fighting over centralized versus decentralized Switzerland. Friedel & Heer Jr. Did study under his father and studied in Chicago under the Denmark, Adler, and Sullivan firm, and attended a Royal Architecture School in Stuttgart, Germany. So from that time period, not a ton happened in the courthouse history until really the mid-20th century. During that time, Dubuque was hit pretty hard by the Great Depression. East Dubuque was called this Hooverville, where very poor people lived in small shacks by the railroad there. Now it's kind of in that B Branch area that's been demolished. But the population had also gradually sort of begun to favor the west end of the city. The suburbanized, kind of automotive-based design of the west end of the city became really popular, and sort of the downtown area had a lot of warehouses, often which weren't really producing any goods anymore, many of which were abandoned. You can look at these John Vachon photographs to see a very rough representation of Dubuque in the early 1940s. So this sort of preceded the urban renewal era and the urban renewal plans for downtown Dubuque. Downtown Dubuque essentially had this huge plan developed for it where we would demolish probably 16, 17, 18 huge full blocks of historic buildings, these granular structures. And there was a really interesting idea by a man named Victor Gruen to demolish basically all of them wholesale, build these super blocks in their place with, very high-story residential buildings, really big sort of top-down urban planning design where like this goes here, this goes there, in what would have been a probably wildly unsuccessful attempt. But we did get some urban renewal out of the process, especially on Main Street, just north of our kind of lower Main Historic District, up north where kind of the town clock is featured on our now pedestrian mall. Courthouse building is actually somewhat unusual in terms of design. Well, it's typically described as a Beaux-Arts building, even regularly described as the best example of Beaux-Arts in Dubuque. It exhibits some other architectural features, and while it is an exceptional piece of architecture, I don't think it's a very precise example of Beaux-Arts style. The building borrows a number of features from Richardsonian Romanesque architecture, including all these round arch windows, which are really a traditionally Romanesque design, and also the treatment of the materials and the stonework, especially more Richardsonian Romanesque in their design. This first level of heavy, natural-faced stone is quite Romanesque. It's kind of showing off this burly, heavy look that we associate with that design type. That design sort of came after Queen Anne designs, which I always think of kind of as being more feminine, while the Richardsonian Romanesque was sort of this burly, masculine take on Victorian design. Fertile here actually designed probably one of our more prominent examples of the Richardsonian, which is the Dubuque Brewing and Malting building, which is a great example of that design with, its kind of heavy stonework, round arch windows, and asymmetrical design. So, in my mind, the best example of the Beaux-Arts architecture, which the courthouse is still, are actually the security building and sort of the bank and insurance building. They have this sort of post-Columbian Exposition, the White City terracotta design where they're fully white terracotta buildings that are cladding over steel. However, the courthouse still does have some of these features of classical architecture that are Beaux-Arts. The building does have these 4 pediments facing each facade. These are really big classical features that are unmistakably Beaux-Arts, and you can't really lump them in with any building that you'd call Richardsonian Romanesque because they're so identified with classical architecture. There's also all these kind of classical motifs in the moldings and in the cornices that are really fitting in with that Beaux-Arts style, even though it also does have those Romanesque features we already talked about. So now we're going to move back inside the building and have Chris and Jason tell you a little bit more about it.
So we're here today in the Dubuque County Courthouse inside with Chris Soder, who is the Facilities and Maintenance Supervisor for Dubuque County. And we're lucky to have him here because he is here in the courthouse every day and knows lots of the stories about why the building looks the way it does, how the building is used, and interesting stories about what we see before us today. So Chris, here on the first floor, we see lots of things that have changed over the years. So could you kind of walk us through some of the renovations that were done in the 80s and 90s and why the building kind of looks the way it does now?
Originally, when the building was first built, access to the courthouse was through the grand staircase out front. You had a couple of access windows for things at this level, but everything went up the stairs and in through the second floors. And one of the things they had to do was make the access way up front, open it up and add additional horizontal reinforcement to support the structure, which you can see with the archways and the open areas as you come in here. This is the core of the building. This center section goes all the way up, all the way to the 5th floor. Above the 5th floor, it narrows down and it goes all the way up into the towers or the cupola, the gold dome area, I guess is the best description for it. And then the structure is all built around that.
Could you tell me a little bit about, I know you said that in the 80s and 90s the elevator was updated, but originally the building, since it was built in the 1890s, was designed with an elevator, but it wasn't an automatic elevator, correct?
No, it was, anybody that's been in the Dubuque area knows American Trust Building had the old manually operated elevator. That's what was here.
Sure.
The lady that ran it had run it for 30 or 40 years, is my understanding. And a couple of gentlemen that worked for me, you know, when she was on vacation, they had to run the elevator, and it was a rough ride according to them. It was very bumpy, and people had to trip over door jams and everything else to get in and out. But it's definitely an art. Moving forward, they had to go to this to meet the safety requirements with all the new current codes and everything else.
Was the original elevator in this location though?
Yes.
Okay, so this, the modern elevator replaced the one, so they did, because some historic buildings, they actually have to like build a new elevator shaft and stuff, but they were able to replace it right in the same location.
Yeah, we were able to use the existing shaft and utilize the majority of the existing equipment that was in there. They updated the traction system and the controls, updated the cab, and of course we just went through another renovation of all the controls now, so they're all nice digital controls and everything would work smoother. When you talk about having to add an elevator shaft and stuff, we had to do that in the old jail next door to get it to meet code so we could use it for office space and for other things. So that can be a trial, and working with the historic folks can make things a little bit more drawn out.
So when this was turned into the main entrance for the building, that's when they put in a water fountain, I would assume, to kind of make it more of a welcoming kind of entrance to this. So this granite water fountain would have been put in the 80s as well?
Yeah, 80s, late 80s, early 90s time frame.
And we also, one of the noteworthy features that we see when we come in is this exposed brick. Now this exposed brick was not part of the original design of the building though, correct?
No. Construction back then would be brick, and then they would either mortar or plaster over it. One of the big things that was done in the 80s and 90s was to eliminate asbestos and lead paint. All the plaster and stuff that was put in back then was full of asbestos to act as fireproofing, but also strengthened it. And lead paint was used on everything because the colors lasted. So there was a major effort. I mean, the entire building was encapsulated to remove lead paint on the exterior, and then there was all work was done into the interior to remove the plaster and get rid of that. And in the process, you get the nice brick, exposed brick, which looks, to me, makes it look like a historic building.
It looks lovely and historic, but it's interesting to think that this isn't what attorneys and people coming into this building in the 1890s would not have seen the building look like this. But we always think of this looking as something that's kind of wonderful and historic, but it's an interesting kind of contrast in how we modernize buildings like this.
And trying to maintain the feeling of the building. You know, there's a certain ambiance to any historic building, and being able to maintain that is critical. You know, you walk in this building, you know it's been around for a while. It's got some history. It's got its own life to it.
Great. So Chris, even though there were buildings being built in the late 1880s and early 1890s out of steel, this building has a masonry structural frame, correct?
Yes. There is steel in it. You know, key horizontal areas were built with steel in it to add structural integrity. The support structure up in the attic, which we'll get a chance to look at, is all steel because the 5th floor is actually suspended off the ceiling structure. But the majority of it is brick and mortar.
So here we actually see a structural arch.
Yes.
So the way that the bricks were laid, they would have had a form, and then they would lay the bricks over that form, and then the structure of the building would have been built upon that. When the mortar dries, they take the form out, and you've got this structural arch. Down at the entrance there, we can see another 4-course, more flat version of that arch that's right there in the exterior structure of the building, that's probably, how thick are the walls over there?
The walls are about 18 to 21 inches thick.
18 to 21 inches?
In that area, the center core area is about 42 to 44 inches.
Wow, okay, because that's supporting the cupola and everything up above.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the reasons that it looks kind of out of place down at that end is the original door was just a door. To meet code and everything else for emergency egress and everything, we had to go to this. But if you come down and look through, you can see the original arches for the windows and stuff that were originally there on the outside.
Oh, sure, yep. So tell us a little bit too about some of the millwork that we see in this structure. We see there's some really wonderful woodwork around the door frames and the window frames. Tell us a little bit. I know you mentioned that some of it was actually salvaged,
Yeah.
and then some of you had to reproduce.
Yeah, the majority of the wood in here is original. Everything like the rosettes and that sort of thing, everything's been salvaged as much as possible anytime renovations have been done. We've had to go and get some special blades cut to be able to mill the pieces of wood because this is not a standard contour.
Yeah, it's got a really interesting profile. Yep.
So we've had to do that.
And hundreds of feet of this probably too, right?
Yeah, a couple of 100 feet.
Yeah.
You pay to have the blades built, and then you have to have some wood cut to make sure they work, of course, but also make sure you have some spare on site.
Well, it's really a wonderful accent to the other historical elements of the building. It really makes it stand out. Really great. So when we talk about the architectural style of this building, we often mention that it's Beaux-Arts or neoclassical, but there are some really interesting elements that really show us that it was built in an era when Romanesque architecture was also very popular, and Fridolin here was undoubtedly very influenced by this kind of newer mode and more modern style of architecture. These balusters that you see here, these newel posts, have a really interesting rounded shape, the rosettes, and this kind of geometry that you see on here is not really neoclassical. It's not something that you would have seen in the classical Beaux-Arts style. And the railings here, as they go up with this geometric pattern, are much more modern than you would see in something that's rigidly neoclassical. So Chris, we're now on the second floor, and this would have been originally, as the building was designed, for the main entrance, for folks coming off Central Avenue into the building. So explain to us a little bit what this would have looked like and some of the changes that have been made here.
You can see where the areas have been blocked off and glassed in. These would have been open all the way out to the front.
Okay.
There would have been the doors and stuff that would come in here. You would have come up a flight of stairs to this area, and then from here you would have gone around, either gone downstairs or upstairs, depending on where you needed to go.
Okay. So we're now up on the second floor, where you would have originally come up the staircase to go into the main entrance. And you know, it's been a generation or so since most Dubuquers were able to actually get on this little platform, but it's really interesting what we can see from up here. These columns, when you get up close to them, you can see that they're actually a mixture of several different materials. At the base here, we can see these are made out of terracotta. Which is a natural, which is a baked clay material that's easy to mold into many different shapes. So we've got some, and you can actually see the marks on these pieces of terracotta where the artist would have smoothed it out and shaped it into these pieces. Then we've got granite, and then up on top we move into more terracotta capitals. It's really interesting too the way the stonework that we see on these columns, from rusticated, rougher types of stone into smooth and then kind of rhythms as they go on up. As we look at the top of these columns, at the terracotta capitals that are up here, and you can tell that they're terracotta because you can see the seams, right? You can see the joints where the pieces of terracotta are joined together. We see when we're up close that these are also really good, they're really interesting and a little bit more of a Romanesque style than something that's rigidly kind of Roman, the neoclassical from like that Beaux-Arts tradition. So Chris, one of the really interesting aspects of the interior is these giant transoms that are still in place over some of these doors. Can you explain a little bit, first of all, the function, like why they were there originally, and then what you've ddone to keep them in working order?
Transom windows were designed for ventilation. The other part was lighting, of course, but primarily it was ventilation. You don't get enough air movement in an old building, especially when there's no fixed ventilation systems to be able to remove air or add air to the building. So you open windows, you open the transoms, which allowed some control, access control, but still allowed air to move and everything else. Most of these are still functional, and we do open them on occasion.
Yeah. Well, especially in this building, I would imagine, because you had that big central atrium that goes all the way up. I imagine that kind of worked almost like
Yeah, it actually,
a chimney that kind of sucked the air from the exterior
Yes.
through these spaces, through the transoms and up
it
through the
actually
top of the
still
building.
does if you feel especially in the wintertime when the building's locked up to close up tight. When people open doors, you can feel the air moving up through
Sure.
up through the center core all the way up.
Yep. So Chris, we're on the staircase here between the second and third floor, and we've got these massive windows that have a strip of stained glass panels here through the middle. And as we kind of look at the designs, it's kind of got that dark orange around the edge. It almost looks like that design would have gone up into another stained glass panel and kind of framed all 8 of those panels out, but you don't really know anything about that, huh?
No, the windows were all replaced in the building back as part of the renovation, 70s, 80s, 90s. So one of the things that came, we salvaged everything that possibly could salvage, because those had to be reframed, and what could very well have happened is the windows were damaged in the process. But one of the things we did when we went to all the new shades in the building was I was trying to maintain the light coming through the stained glass. To me, it was, when the sun is right, this is a very intriguing color pattern in this area of the stairwell.
So you purchased shades that didn't come down all the way then?
Yep.
You had to get 2 sets of shades, one down below and one up above.
Specifically for that.
This is really an interesting pattern. It looks like these are ceramic tiles here too, and this is a really interesting basket weave design. I know you said before you don't really know much about the history of this and things too, but these are ceramic tiles that are laid in a wonderful geometric pattern that look very period to me, like they probably could date back to the original design of the building, I think. So one of the things that most historic buildings have to deal with at some point is to remain safe is sprinkling. So here we can actually see some of the retrofitted sprinklers, since that was not part of the building's original design, right?
Yes. No, back in the day, they didn't have the capabilities to be able to pump the water that high and maintain the pressure needed for it anyway. It was not something that was even thought about. One of the significant benefits of it is to preserve this building. If we ever have a fire, the odds of a very minute amount of the building being damaged is what's going to happen.
So now we're here in the North Courtroom. This is a place that most people aren't going to see unless they're on jury duty or sitting behind one of these tables here. So tell us a little bit about the configuration of this, Chris, because this looks significantly different than what we would have seen when the building was built in the 1890s, and how the courtrooms are used differently.
Back in the late 1800s, back before the early 1900s, court in general, any court proceedings were part of community entertainment, if you want to call it that. It was very important that people were there to see how everything went. The original layout in here had a gallery above, as well as the area we're standing in now. The difference between then and now, one is, well, we got Court TV, which is all in and of itself is not as realistic as it should be. The other part is what goes on in here is what makes society what it is. So
right above this drop ceiling, where that drop ceiling is now, there would have been like a balustrade up above with some tiered seating kind of up above.
The whole thing would have been open. The floor that's above there wasn't there.
Right.
So
this whole area would have been open, people
Yep.
looking down into the courtroom
Yes.
to see the proceedings. Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. And the other thing I think we can really see that we can, now that we're here up close, really some wonderful original carving, hand-done carving on this. Again, very reminiscent of that Romanesque style on these newel posts and on the railings. And of course on the bench where the judge sits, we have some really wonderful hand carving on those. For some of the chairs, the original chairs?
The original chairs, yeah.
Oh.
We've done everything we can to keep those as up to date as we can and functional.
looks like those chairs have seen a lot of action over the years. So,
Oh, yeah.
but it's great to still see them there in working order. So it sounds like you're doing quite a bit of work to make sure the building is energy efficient and that you're not spending a lot of money on energy use in the building. So could you walk us through a little bit about the upgrades that you've been doing?
First upgrade we started probably 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, is the entire HVAC system, the heating, ventilation, and cooling system has been completely upgraded to new high efficiency units. We've added the blackout shades as well as just the sun dimming shades to help control the heat coming in from the sun. And then, of course, lighting. You know, every building had fluorescent lighting. We've gone to the LED flat panel lights. It's more natural light. It's easier, definitely easier on the eyes, and it's way energy efficient. Probably we use a quarter to a third of the power we would use from one of these panels to one of the fluorescent panels.
So because we can see here in this room, like these are the new LED flat panels.
Yep.
And then those are the old fluorescent panels. And you said how many bulbs and what's the wattage?
There's 4 bulbs in there, and there's 4 32 or 37 watt bulbs in there. So you're looking at 4 bulbs, you know, 120, 130, you know, 1,200 and some watts per fixture, if not more, where we're using maybe 34 watts per fixture in the LED fixtures.
So once all the lights are swapped out, you might even save a quarter of the cost on some of your lighting for a lot of these fixtures.
Plus, the other side of it is LED fixtures last tremendously longer. In 6 months' time, you can lose anywhere from 10 to 15 or 20% of the light output from a fluorescent. Whereas these are rated at 50,000 hours. At 50,000 hours, they're only going to lose 20% of their light.
And fluorescent bulbs are also kind of hazardous waste, right? So
They're
disposing
hard to
of
dispose
them
of.
and all those things is probably a big headache for you.
Yeah,
I
it
would
is.
assume.
Yeah, and when you generate a lot of them, if you're changing them out to maintain the maximum lighting you need, you change them out very often.
So we're now on the 4th floor, and we're in the library, the law library, which is very nice. It's got this wonderful window here looking out over the city. But this wasn't always a law library. Tell us a little bit how the 4th floor used to operate.
The 4th floor originally was part of the galleries for the courtrooms. When they started having to expand the county attorney's offices and other offices, they had to make space in here. So what they did was got rid of the galleries because less people were coming to court proceedings as spectators, and decided to take advantage of that and create the additional floors.
Now we're all the way up on the 5th floor.
Yes.
And there's an interesting structural system that holds it up that allows the space below us to be column free, to leave that space all kind of more open. So explain to us a little bit what the structure is up here.
What you have supporting this floor is a set of beams and rods that go down, that cross over from the edge of the structure and go down to other beams that actually support this entire floor. So it's a suspended floor. It's suspended from the roof.
Because this steel beam here goes all the way out to the masonry walls
Yep.
and across, so that's supporting that load, and then these are hanging down and kind of supporting them down from below through a structure that's within the floor.
And then if you look, you can see where the beams come in,
Yep.
tie in here to go all the way up into the roof structure.
Sure.
Which we can see from outside.
Yeah, let's go take a look at that roof structure. So just so folks are oriented here, I want to make sure they understand what we're looking at here. So behind us, this is the building's core, which is completely made out of masonry. And how thick are those walls about?
42 inches. on
42
average.
inches, so these are very thick masonry walls. Then we've got this big steel truss that connects the masonry core out to the exterior walls. How thick are those exterior masonry walls?
22 inches.
About 22 inches. So the steel truss that we're seeing then here supports the ceiling up above for the roof, but also we saw those supports that also hang down and support the 5th floor
Yep.
on them. So it's really an interesting structure here. And are these are all riveted, I assume?
Yes.
Yep.
All riveted.
Okay. Because it's interesting, in this era we were starting to see more of a transition into steel construction away from masonry. But sometimes you would have seen a building in this era have big timbers, like wooden timbers in the roof. So it's interesting to see this being kind of relatively delicate looking steel members holding this up. It's really cool.
And when you look at the center core, one of the things, the center core goes all the way up to the gold dome. So everything from the gold dome down is supported in the center core, all the way down to street level.
About 3 years ago, you all undertook a pretty massive restoration of the exterior of the courthouse here. Could you walk us through that a bit?
Sure. The project initially started because we had to re-roof the building. When we started getting more and more into it, not just the building, we had brick repair we had to make, we had to do some massive painting and metal repairs. All the statuary had to be basically taken down, stripped bare, and rebuilt. Serious artistry involved with that. Geezy Roofing I'll put a plug in for, because those guys were amazing with that project. Plus all the other metalwork up there that had to be repaired and be repainted. We also resealed all the windows to make sure that we were a little more airtight than we were before.
Sure.
It was a massive project. It took the better part of 18 months. A lot of it was done off-site because we couldn't do the work on-site.
Because what we're looking at here, almost all of the decorative cornice work that got repainted, the triangular pediment, the balustrades and things up on the cupola, that's mostly pressed metal, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And before the restoration, that was almost all white too, right? So now we've got a wider range of colors in the mix too, right?
To bring back some of the original colors that we were able to find, the stuff that is now gold, that was originally gold colored. The colors for the lower pediment all the way around the building was not that color, it was white, and we brought it back as close to original color as we could. The statuary we brought back, it was originally basically pewter or nickel, plate nickel, and what was happening is they painted over it, and in the process of painting over it, it started to break down. So we had to make the repairs, and when we made the repairs, we brought it back as close to the original color as possible with the paint that's up there.
I know you said at one point too, when you could take those statues down, you could kind of look up inside them, and you could just see, look like confetti, like just pinholes through the statues. I mean, they were in pretty rough shape.
It looked like star constellations in them.
Yeah.
And the fact that a lot of them had bird nests, just the acid that builds up in the moisture in there starts to eat things away too.
Sure.
So that was another part of what we did when we brought them down. It was completely cleaned them out, blasted them inside and out, made all the repairs, painted them, sealed them up so they wouldn't be as readily accessible to the flying critters, and made a big difference.
Well, and thank you for all of the architecture nerds really appreciated it when you were doing this, because after the statue up there with the shield and the sword had been restored, you installed her in the lobby for a while. We got a nice up close look. It was kind of awesome. So that was cool. Thanks for doing that. That was really fun. The other thing you mentioned before too was that you installed new lighting on the building as well during this restoration.
Yeah, all the statues are now lit that were all the statues are now lit that were never lit before, and we had upgraded 5 years ago. We had upgraded the lights on the gold dome to an LED, high intensity, basically stadium LED lighting to be able to show the structure.
And you also said too, I believe, that some of the paint that you used for the cornice work and some of the other restoration work has some metallic flakes in it too, so it's a little more reflective.
Yes, it brings out the color more, especially when the sun's shining, and it allows it to contrast with the surrounding brickwork and the surrounding whitework.
Well, it's very striking, and it really adds a whole. The building looks completely different now that work has been done. It's really a striking difference. When you were doing the work too, I know you got some up close and personal looks at the dome and the statue up at the top. Could you explain a little bit too about the gold leafing that's on the cupola up there, and kind of how that came to be in the first place, and kind of what the future of that holds?
The original structure was basically just polished copper, and of course it changes color to a greenish shade as part of the aging of the copper. Back, I'm going to say late 70s, early 80s, it was decided to put gold up there to highlight the dome, to make it something that was more visual for everybody in the area.
Well, that was also a period, I believe, that there was some serious discussion about tearing this building down.
Yes.
So I think there was an effort to highlight the historic nature of it and really kind of invest in that. So I think that was an effort too, to make sure people knew, like, this is something worth saving.
Oh yes, definitely.
Yep.
The gold leaf that was put on there, they had some issues with it started coming off rather rapidly because of there's what they call a seizing compound that goes behind it, and the temperatures weren't quite right. The seizing compound did not function properly. It happens. It's one of those things, trying to rush something in the bad weather. It was put on again in 1990, early 90s, 94 I believe is when it was finally redone. And in the process, that one's lasted a long time.
Well, that's about going to wrap it up for today's ArchiTREK. We were so lucky to be joined by Chris, the building manager for the county courthouse. Yeah, Jason, you want to say goodbye? Anything in closing? Closing statements?
Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. I think you'll see that on this tour, doing it as a video tour might have been extra special and really helped you see some of these little tiny undiscovered spaces. But we are looking forward to actually doing real tours and being out on the street sometime soon. So keep your eyes open for updates from Heritage Works, updates from the Dubuque Museum of Art, who co-sponsors this event and helps us spread the word and brings all of their membership and resources to it too. So special thanks to them, and we'll see you soon out on the streets.
Thank you.